I said no to him 3 times. The fourth time I said yes, and we spent the next 30 years together. I want to tell you the story of how I almost let the best thing in my life walk away. Not once, but 3 separate times, across 12 years, before I finally understood what I actually wanted. It started when I was 18, walking into my very first class at college, completely unaware that the boy sitting 2 seats away from me would end up being the person I'd spend the next 3 decades with. His name was Robert, and the first time I really noticed him wasn't in class at all. It was in the cafeteria, where he dropped an entire tray of food trying to balance 3 textbooks under one arm. And instead of getting embarrassed, he just laughed at himself so hard that half the room ended up laughing with him. I remember thinking, that's someone I want to know. Not someone I wanted to date. Just someone I wanted around. For the first few months, that's exactly what he was. Around. We ended up in 3 classes together that semester, completely by accident, and somewhere between study sessions and late-night pizza runs, we became inseparable. He remembered small things, like which professor I couldn't stand, or that I took my coffee with too much sugar for someone who claimed to be watching her diet. I told him everything. My family issues, my insecurities, the things I was too embarrassed to say out loud to anyone else. So when he asked me to be his girlfriend that first time, sitting on the steps outside the library on an unusually warm evening during our freshman year, I honestly thought he was joking. "I'm serious," he said when I laughed. "I think we'd be good together." "Robert, you're my best friend," I said, still smiling, still not fully registering how serious his face had gone. "That would be weird." He nodded, quiet for a second, then shrugged it off like it cost him nothing, and we went back to normal within the hour. For years passed before he asked again. We'd both graduated by then, moved to different cities for our first real jobs, me in marketing, him in finance, but somehow we never lost touch, calling each other most weekends just to talk through whatever our weeks had thrown at us. I was 22, freshly heartbroken from a relationship that had ended badly, sitting on the phone with him late one night, crying about a man who clearly hadn't deserved my tears in the first place. "You know," he said quietly after I'd finally stopped crying, "I would never do that to you. Not in a million years." "I know you wouldn't," I said. "You're the best person I know." "Then why not us?" he asked, and I could hear something different in his voice this time. Something steadier than the library steps years earlier. "I've thought about it more than you probably realize." I sat with that question longer than I had the first time, staring at my dark apartment ceiling, genuinely trying to imagine it. But something in me still resisted, some fear I couldn't fully name. "I don't want to lose you by getting this wrong," I finally said. "You mean too much to risk it." He accepted that answer the way he'd accepted the first one, without bitterness, though I could hear something heavier in his voice when we said goodnight. 3 more years passed before the third time. I was 25, and my father had just been diagnosed with early-stage cancer, and Robert, without me even asking, drove 6 hours to sit with me in a hospital waiting room, missing an important deadline at his own job to do it. We sat there for hours, mostly in silence, until visiting hours ended, and we found ourselves in the hospital parking lot at midnight, both of us exhausted in that particular way fear exhausts a person. "I keep showing up," he said, leaning against his car, looking at me directly for the first time all night. "Every single time something falls apart in your life, I'm already halfway there before you even ask. Doesn't that tell you something?" "It tells me you're an incredible friend," I said, my voice cracking from exhaustion more than anything else. "I don't want to just be your incredible friend anymore, Linda," he said. "I've asked you twice already. I'm asking again, because I don't think I'll stop wondering otherwise." I remember standing in that parking lot, 25 years old, terrified in a way that had nothing to do with my father's diagnosis and everything to do with the man standing in front of me. "I can't," I said quietly. "Not right now. Not with everything happening." He nodded, the same familiar nod, and drove the 6 hours back home that same night without complaint, because that's simply who he was. I didn't see him nearly as often over the next few years. Our careers pulled us further apart geographically, and though we still talked, the easy rhythm we'd once had grew a little more distant, a little more effortful to maintain. I had no idea that the next chapter of our story would completely upend everything I thought I understood about my own heart. I was 29 when I finally moved back to the same city as Robert, taking a new position at a marketing firm that happened to be only a few blocks from his office. We fell back into our old rhythm almost immediately, grabbing lunch a couple times a month, catching up on the years we'd spent apart, and for a while, it felt like nothing had ever changed between us. It was during one of those lunches that he mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd started seeing someone from his office. Nothing serious, he said, just a few dinners here and there with a woman on his team. Nice enough, easy company. He said it so casually that I nodded along and changed the subject entirely, genuinely believing it didn't affect me one way or another. A few weeks later, our whole friend group gathered for someone's engagement party, and Robert brought her along. I don't even remember her name clearly anymore, only that she laughed easily and touched his arm often, the kind of small, comfortable touches that come from people who've spent real time together. I watched them from across the room, holding a glass of wine I wasn't really drinking, and felt something twist sharply in my chest that I hadn't expected at all. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was simply protective of my best friend, the way you'd feel protective of anyone you cared about meeting someone new. But that explanation stopped holding up the moment she said something that made him laugh, that same easy laugh from the cafeteria 11 years earlier. And I realized my hands had curled into fists at my sides without my permission. I left that party earlier than I should have, claiming a headache, and spent most of the drive home trying to talk myself out of what I already knew to be true. A few days later, Robert called to see if I wanted to grab coffee before work, something we hadn't done in months. We sat outside a small cafe near his office, and somewhere between his usual complaints about a difficult coworker and my update on a new client, I found myself blurting out something I hadn't planned to say at all. "Are you serious about her?" I asked, cutting him off mid-sentence. He blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Who, Danielle?" "No, not really. We're just having fun." "Why do you ask?" "Because I think I've been an idiot," I said, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "For 12 years, actually." Robert set his coffee down slowly, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Watching you with her at that party," I continued, forcing the words out before I lost my nerve completely, "made me realize something I should have understood a long time ago. I think I've loved you for years, Robert. I think I've always loved you. And I was just too scared to risk losing you as my best friend to ever admit it." For a long moment he just looked at me, and I genuinely couldn't tell if I'd just ruined everything or fixed it. Then slowly the corner of his mouth pulled into that familiar, easy smile. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "my offer's technically still on the table. Considering you already said no 3 times, I figure this makes attempt number 4. I let out a laugh that came out somewhere between relief and disbelief, wiping at my eyes with the back of my hand. "Are you seriously proposing to me over coffee?" I asked. "After everything, this is how you're doing it." "Feels fitting, honestly," he said, still smiling, though I could see his hands weren't entirely steady around his cup. "So what do you say? 4th time's the charm." "Yes," I said, without a single second of hesitation. "Robert, yes." He reached across the small cafe table and took my hand, right there in front of strangers having their own ordinary mornings. And for the first time in 12 years, neither of us had anything left to be afraid of. We were married 2 years later, and Danielle, as it turned out, ended up being one of the guests at our wedding, having become good friends with both of us in the meantime, something we still laugh about to this day. I'm 60 years old now, and it still catches me off guard sometimes. How quickly 30 years can move when you're not watching closely enough. I'm sitting on the same back porch we've sat on for the better part of 3 decades, the wood worn smooth in places from years of coffee mornings and quiet evenings, watching Robert attempt badly to teach our granddaughter how to ride a bike in the backyard below us. She's 6, the same age I was when I first learned to read his handwriting on notes he used to slide under my dorm room door, and watching him jog alongside her, one hand hovering just behind the seat. I can still see traces of that same clumsy, warm-hearted boy who dropped an entire lunch tray in front of half the cafeteria. His hair is grayer than it used to be, and his knees complain louder than they should after chasing after a 6-year-old for 20 minutes straight, But that same easy laugh hasn't changed one bit since that very first day. Our granddaughter wobbles, nearly tips over, and he catches her without missing a beat, laughing along with her instead of panicking, exactly the way he's always handled every fall in my own life too. He finally lets her go on her own for a few wobbly feet, cheering loudly enough that our neighbors probably hear him, then makes his way up to the porch, breathing hard, dropping into the chair beside mine with a groan that makes me laugh. "You ever regret saying no those first 3 times?" he asked, still catching his breath, watching our granddaughter attempt another lap across the grass. I reached over and laced my fingers through his, weathered now, the same hands that once shook slightly while asking me a question over coffee at a small cafe table, steady now in a way that only 3 decades of showing up for each other can make them. "Not for 1 second, I said, watching our granddaughter pedal a little further this time, wobbling but upright. "I think some things just need exactly the amount of time they need. 12 years for questions and 30 years later, here we still are." Robert squeezed my hand and didn't say anything else for a while, and we just sat there together, the way we always have, watching the next generation learn how to fall and get back up again, right in front of us.